Today was supposed to be the best day of my son's career. I walked into that glass tower on Fifth Avenue, carrying a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for 11 years, and the moment the elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor, I heard a voice booming across the entire office. "You are nothing. You were never anything. You think marrying my daughter made you somebody?" And through the glass wall of the executive suite, I saw my son, David, standing there frozen, his tie slightly crooked, his face the color of ash, while 40 of his coworkers watched in dead silence. The man screaming at him was Richard Holloway, his father-in-law, his boss. Before I tell you what happened in that office, you need to understand how the morning started, because every detail of it matters now. The champagne was a 2013 vintage, something French with a name I could barely pronounce, bought from a shop on Lexington that David had once mentioned in passing years ago, back when he still told me things. I wore my good coat, the gray wool one Linda picked out before she passed, the one I only wear for occasions that feel like they matter. And today mattered. David had called me the night before, his voice cracking with something I hadn't heard from him since he was 12 years old and made varsity. "Dad," he said, "they're making me VP of operations tomorrow. Please come. I want you there." I built a logistics company from a single truck and a phone line 34 years ago. I've sat across from men who could end careers with a signature, and I never once let my hands shake in a negotiation. But standing outside that elevator, holding a bottle of champagne for my son's promotion, I felt something close to what I imagine soldiers feel before they know the ground beneath them is about to disappear. Linda died 4 years ago. Heart failure, sudden. No warning. Gone before the ambulance made it 3 blocks. David was the one who held our family together after that, who called me every Sunday, even when I didn't answer, who married Richard Holloway's daughter, Vanessa, 2 years ago, in a wedding I paid for. Because Richard said, and I quote, "Family should invest in family." I should have known then what kind of man he was. So when the elevator doors slid open, and I heard Richard's voice cutting through the office like a blade, something in my chest went cold and still, the way it does right before you understand that everything is about to change. "You embarrass this company," Richard was shouting, jabbing a finger toward David's chest. "You embarrassed my daughter. You embarrassed me. Effective immediately. You're finished here. Security will escort you out." David didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, shoulders curved inward. A grown man, reduced to nothing in front of 40 people who used to call him Sir. Nobody noticed me standing by the elevator. Nobody saw the bottle of champagne slip quietly back into my coat pocket. I didn't say a word. I didn't storm in. I didn't do what the old version of me, the man from the Marines, the man who built an empire, would have done 20 years ago. I turned around. I walked back into that elevator. And as the doors closed on my son's humiliation, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 6 years. It rang twice. "Marcus," I said, my voice flat, controlled, terrifyingly calm. "I need you to fire every one of them. We'll never run this company. You were a mistake your father-in-law fixed." That word, mistake, hit me harder than anything I'd heard in 30 years of business. I stood frozen in that elevator threshold, champagne bottle sweating in my hand, and I made myself breathe before I let myself think. Before I tell you what I did next, You need to understand who was standing in that hallway. Because the man these people saw when they looked at me was not the man who built the thing they were standing inside of. My name is Walter Coyle. 41 years ago, I was a 19-year-old kid from a steel town in Ohio with $60 in my pocket and a duffel bag that used to belong to my father. I slept in my car for 4 months in Cleveland, while I worked 2 jobs and read every book on logistics and freight I could get my hands on from the public library, because the library was warm and it was free. Nobody handed me a single thing. I built a freight and shipping company from a single leased truck into a network that now moves cargo through 11 countries. And I did it by learning, the hard way, that the people who talk the loudest in a room are almost never the ones who understand it best. I married Elaine when I was 26. She was the only person who ever looked at me and saw past the grease on my hands. We had 1 son, Nathaniel, and for 9 years the 3 of us built a life I still dream about some nights. Then Elaine got sick, ovarian cancer, 14 months from the first scan to the funeral. And I spent every one of those months split between hospital rooms and boardrooms, because the company had 400 employees by then who needed their paychecks, and a son who needed his father to still be standing when it was over. I raised Nathaniel alone after that. I coached his baseball team even after 12-hour days. I sat through every parent-teacher conference by myself, and I never once let him see me the way the world saw me in business magazines, because I didn't want my success to become the reason people were kind to him. I wanted him loved for exactly who he was, the same way his mother had loved me. That's the real reason I wear this old jacket. It's canvas, olive drab, cuffs frayed white, a small tear at the left shoulder I've never bothered to mend. I bought it secondhand the year I started the company, back when it cost $12 and represented every cent I could spare. I still wear it on the days that matter most, because it reminds me where I came from, and because it lets me walk into a room and simply watch. People don't perform for a man in a torn jacket. They show you exactly who they are. My board of directors knows the truth. My assistant knows the truth. But the world sees a quiet, aging man who shows up to family events in worn-out clothes, drives a 12-year-old truck, and never says much. My own son's father-in-law had no idea that the man he'd occasionally seen shuffling around family gatherings, the one he probably assumed was some distant, broke uncle, controlled a company 3 times the size of his own. So when I heard that voice thundering down the 40th floor, calling my son a mistake, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even set down the champagne. I simply reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I hadn't used in almost a decade. To understand who was in that room and how my son ended up standing in it, because none of this happened by accident. It happened over 3 years, one polite dinner at a time. My son's name is Daniel. He's 32, an engineer by training, the kind of kid who fixed the neighbor's lawnmower for free just because he liked solving things. He met Vanessa Calloway at a charity gala I actually dragged him to. Her father, Richard Holloway, owns Calloway Industries, a logistics and manufacturing empire that does something like $4 billion a year. I know because I used to compete against pieces of that empire back when I was still building freight routes up and down the East Coast. Daniel came home that night lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy building model bridges out of balsa wood. He said, "Dad, I met someone." I smiled and told him that was wonderful, because it was. I didn't know her last name yet. When I found out, I felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't name at the time. Now I know exactly what it was. It was instinct. I'd crossed paths with Richard Holloway twice in my career, both times across a negotiating table, both times walking away with the distinct feeling that I'd been handled rather than dealt with honestly. He was the kind of man who smiled while he was taking something from you. Charming, generous with compliments, ruthless underneath it. The kind of man who collects people the way other men collect watches. But Daniel was in love, and Vanessa seemed genuine, sweet even. She laughed at his terrible jokes and asked him real questions about his work, instead of just nodding along. I watched them together over dinners and holidays for almost 2 years, and I started to believe maybe I was wrong about the family. Maybe money hadn't rotted all of them. They married in a ceremony that cost more than my first house. I stood in the back during the toasts, watching Richard Holloway beam at his daughter, and I told myself to let go of the old suspicion. This was Daniel's life now, not mine to worry over. Then came the job. Richard offered Daniel a position at Holloway Industries. Not an executive seat, not even close. An entry-level operations role, the kind you'd give a fresh graduate with no connections at all. Daniel could have easily started his own company, could have taken offers from 3 other firms that actually respected his engineering background. Instead, he chose to start at the bottom of his father-in-law's ladder. I remember sitting across from him at my kitchen table when he told me. I asked him why. He said, "I want to earn it, Dad. I don't want anyone saying I only got somewhere because of who I married." I understood that. I respected it, honestly. But I also remembered something my own father told me decades ago, back when I was clawing my way up through an industry that ate soft men alive. He said, "Jan, son, pride and control run the deepest in families that already have everything. They don't let you in. They let you audition." I said something similar to Daniel that night, gently, carefully. I told him to keep his eyes open, to trust his work, but watch the room. He laughed it off, kissed his wife's photo on the counter, and told me Richard had welcomed him like a son. I wanted so badly to believe that was true. It didn't start with shouting. It never does. It started with small things. Things you could almost excuse if you tried hard enough. And Daniel tried hard enough for 3 years. The first month, they called it learning the culture. Daniel would leave the house at 6 in the morning and come home after 10 at night. And when I asked him how work was going, he'd smile that tired smile of his and say, "Building trust, Dad, takes time." I believed him because I wanted to, because his wife, Rebecca, seemed happy, and because her father, Gerald Voss, had built Voss Capital from nothing. And I respected that, even if something about the man's eyes never sat right with me. Then came the second month, and the overtime that never showed up on his paycheck. Daniel mentioned it once, almost in passing, like it embarrassed him to say it out loud. They said salaried employees don't get overtime, Dad. It's fine. I asked him how many hours he was putting in. He said 65, sometimes 70. For the same number they'd agreed on for 40. I didn't say anything then. I told myself it was his marriage, his career, his life to build. but a father notices things. I noticed the way he stopped talking about his ideas at dinner. I noticed the report he showed me in March, an entire supply chain restructuring plan he'd built from scratch. 6 months of work, spreadsheets thick enough to choke a printer. 2 weeks later, I watched Gerald present that exact plan at a shareholders' lunch, word for word, and take a standing ovation for it while Daniel sat 3 tables back, clapping along with everyone else. "Why didn't you say something?" I asked him afterward. "Because he's my father-in-law, Dad. Because Rebecca would be caught in the middle. Because I have to prove myself first." Prove himself. That phrase haunted me because I heard it every single time I called him, like a script he'd been handed and told to memorize. Prove yourself, Daniel. Earn it, Daniel. Nothing comes free, Daniel. By the 6th month, the belittling had become public sport. At Rebecca's cousin's engagement party, Gerald introduced Daniel to a room full of investors as my son-in-law, the intern. Everyone laughed. Daniel laughed too, because what else do you do when the man who controls your paycheck, your marriage's peace, and your wife's inheritance makes a joke at your expense in front of 40 people? Rebecca's mother, Diane, was worse in her own quiet way. She'd correct Daniel's grammar at dinner. She'd ask him, in front of guests, if he'd finally learned how business actually works, as though he hadn't graduated top of his class in mechanical engineering, as though he hadn't built 2 successful patents before he ever met their daughter. I watched my son shrink, not physically. Daniel still stood 6'2", still had that broad-shouldered frame from years of rowing crew in college. But something inside him folded inward, month after month, meeting after meeting. Insult after insult, he swallowed to keep peace with a family that saw him as furniture with a paycheck. "Why do you stay?" I asked him once, late at night, both of us sitting on my back porch with 2 beers we barely touched. He looked at me, and for a second I saw the boy who used to fix lawnmowers for free. "Because I love her, Dad. And because if I walk away, they win. I have to prove I'm not what he says I am." I nodded. I didn't argue. But that night, lying awake, I started paying closer attention. I started keeping notes, dates, names, numbers. Because something told me this wasn't going to end with Daniel proving anything. It was going to end with someone paying for it. I need to take you back to that room, because I've replayed it 1,000 times since, and every time I see something new, some detail I missed the first time through. The office was open plan, glass walls, the kind of place designed so everyone can see everyone else succeed or fail in public. Daniel was standing near his desk, and across from him stood Richard Ashford, his father-in-law, the man who built this logistics company from a single warehouse in Newark 40 years ago. Richard was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than Daniel's first car, and his face was red in that particular way that told me this hadn't started 5 minutes ago. This had been building all morning, maybe all week, maybe all 3 years. Around them, at least a dozen employees had stopped pretending to work. Some were peeking over monitors. Others just stood there, frozen. Because when the boss starts screaming, you don't leave, you watch, you learn who's safe and who isn't. Richard's hand was on a banker's box. Daniel's things, a framed photo, a mug, a small stack of folders. He'd already packed it. He'd already decided before Daniel even knew what was happening. "You embarrassed me in front of the Kowalski account," Richard said, loud enough for the whole floor. "And I have spent 3 years cleaning up your embarrassments." Do you understand what people say about me because I let you sit in that chair? They say, I've gone soft. They say, I'm sentimental. I am not sentimental, Daniel. I am done. Daniel tried to speak. And I know my son. I know that, voice cracks a little when he's trying to stay calm. When he's trying to be reasonable with someone who has already made up their mind. Richard, the Kowalski numbers were approved by 3 people above me. If you'll just look at I don't need you to explain my own company to me. Richard shoved the box toward him, hard enough that a picture frame slid off the top and hit the carpet, glass cracking. Nobody moved to pick it up. Daniel bent down and picked it up himself. And that image, my son on one knee in front of 40 coworkers, gathering his broken photo off the floor. That's the one that still keeps me up some nights. That's when Richard said it. The line I heard from the elevator. You were never anything. You will never run this company. You were a mistake your father-in-law fixed. I found out later, piecing it together from a shaking security guard and from Daniel himself once he could talk about it, that Richard had said other things before that too. That Daniel only got the job because his wife, Richard's daughter Vanessa, begged for it. That every promotion Daniel earned had actually been arranged behind the scenes, softened, managed, so he wouldn't look incompetent in front of the staff. That the last 3 years, every dinner where Richard raised a glass to my son-in-law, the future of this company, every single toast, had been a performance for an audience that wasn't even Daniel. He wasn't just fired. He was told, in front of everyone he worked with, that he had never earned a single thing in his life. And then 2 security guards, men Daniel used to bring coffee to on early mornings, walked him to the elevator like he was a threat instead of a 32-year-old man who'd given 3 years of 16-hour days to a family that called itself his own. I stepped out of that elevator 2 minutes after he stepped into it going down. I need you to understand something before I go further because it changes everything you've heard so far. My name isn't on any door at that company. It never has been. 22 years ago, when Robert Ashford was a mid-level manager, drowning in debt and desperate to buy out his previous partner, I was the man who wrote the check. 40% of that company has belonged to me since before Daniel was born, sitting quiet in a holding company with a name so boring nobody ever asks questions about it. Robert Ashford built the furniture, but I own the floor it stands on. He never knew who I was. To him, I was a nom on a quarterly report, a silent number that occasionally sent a signed proxy vote through his lawyers. He built his kingdom for 3 years and paraded my son through it like a mop boy. And the whole time, without knowing it, he was performing for his own landlord. So I stood in that elevator threshold with the champagne going warm in my hand, and I did not storm into the room. I did not shout. Rage like that, the real kind, the kind that's been compounding quietly for 3 years, doesn't need volume. It needs precision. I stepped back into the elevator, pressed the button for the parking level, and by the time the doors closed, I already had my phone against my ear. Marguerite picked up on the second ring. She's run my legal affairs for 19 years, and in 19 years, I have called her outside business hours maybe 4 times. She knew immediately something had shifted. I need the Ashford Group board notified within the hour, I told her. Emergency session. Cite the majority shareholder clause, Section 11. The one Robert's lawyers never bothered reading closely because they assumed I'd stay quiet forever. "You're invoking that publicly?" she asked. There was no hesitation in her voice, only confirmation. The way a soldier confirms an order they already suspect they'll be given. "Publicly, immediately, completely," I said. "I want Robert Ashford removed from his position by end of day. I want his wife's consulting contract terminated. I want his daughter-in-law's department dissolved and folded elsewhere. I want every name that signed off on my son's termination letter walked out of that building with a box under their arm before 5 o'clock. Marguerite paused for exactly 1 second. "All of them?" "Every one of them," I said. "Fire every one of them." I hung up before she could ask why, because there was no explaining 30 years of silence collapsing into 30 seconds of decision. I sat in my car in that parking garage for 11 minutes, engine off, hands on the wheel, watching floor after floor of glass windows above me, knowing that somewhere up there my son was still standing by his desk, not knowing his father had just detonated the building he'd been humiliated in. I thought about calling Daniel right then. I didn't. Some things a father has to finish before he explains them. I thought about my late wife, about what she would have said watching me do this, and I decided she would have told me I waited too long already. 3 years too long, watching our son shrink himself smaller and smaller to fit into a family that never intended to make room for him. The phone buzzed 40 minutes later. Marguerite again. Her voice was flat, professional, but I heard something underneath it, something like awe. "It's done," she said. "All of it. They're calling it downstairs right now." I closed my eyes and let out a breath I feel like I'd been holding for 3 years. I bought 51%. Silent partner. That was the phrase Robert used at the diner where we shook hands, back when his suit still had the tags half hidden inside the collar because he couldn't afford a new one and hadn't bothered removing the old one properly. Silent partner meant I never walked the floors. I never sat in the meetings. I collected my share every quarter, and I let Robert believe the company was entirely his creation. Because that was the deal. And because I liked watching a man build something with his own hands, even if my money was the scaffolding underneath it. So when Daniel came to me 3 years ago and said he'd met a girl, Robert's daughter, Whitney, and that he wanted to marry her, I didn't tell him. I told myself I was protecting his pride, letting him earn his place the way I once earned mine. I told myself a lot of things. The dinner where they announced the engagement, Robert sat across from me at the table, raised his glass and said, "Welcome to the family, Daniel. Ashford Logistics could use blood like yours." He didn't know whose blood was already in it. That was the first lie I let live. I've had 3 years to regret it. Back to the room. The glass walls. Daniel standing near his desk with a cardboard box already half packed, because someone from HR, a woman named Priscilla who, I would later learn, had been with the company 11 months and owed her position entirely to being Whitney's college roommate, had walked it over to him that morning before he'd even taken his coat off. Robert stood a few feet away, arms crossed, not looking at Daniel directly, looking instead at the glass wall behind him, like he was rehearsing a speech for an audience that wasn't there yet. Whitney stood beside her father, not beside her husband, beside her father. "It's not personal, Daniel," Robert said, loud enough that 3 other desks stopped typing. "The board wants restructuring. Your position's redundant." There was no board. I know that now. There's never been a board. not one that votes on anything real. There's Robert, and there's whoever Robert wants to impress that week. Daniel didn't raise his voice. That's the part that still guts me when I think about it. 32 years old, watching his marriage and his career collapse in the same 90 seconds under fluorescent light. And he said, "Okay, can I at least say goodbye to my team?" Priscilla said no. Company policy. Security would escort him. Whitney didn't say anything at all. She checked her phone. I wasn't in that room. I got the story later from Marisol in accounting, who'd worked for me for 6 years, before I ever handed her off to Robert's payroll, who called me the second she got to her car in the parking garage, voice shaking. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "they did it in front of everyone. They didn't even let him take his monitor." I sat in my study for a long time after that call, longer than I want to admit. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat, and I looked at the phone in my hand like it was a loaded thing. 22 years I'd stayed silent. 22 years of collecting checks and staying out of the way and letting Robert believe he'd built a kingdom alone. I thought about Daniel carrying that cardboard box past the desks of people pretending not to watch. Then I dialed a number I hadn't used in almost a decade, my attorney's private line. And when he picked up, I didn't say hello. I said, "I need you to pull every document on Ashford Logistics, tonight." 6 months have passed since that phone call, and I want to tell you where everyone ended up, because endings matter almost as much as the moments that lead to them. Robert Ashford lost the company within 90 days. Not because I destroyed it out of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in watching arrogance collapse under its own weight. I simply stopped protecting people who never knew they needed protecting. The board I quietly controlled voted to dissolve his division. His executive team scattered to competitors who had heard the whispers and wanted nothing to do with the mess. His wife, Linda, the one who called my son a mistake at their own dinner table, filed for divorce 4 weeks after the company folded. Turns out loyalty built on someone else's success doesn't survive contact with failure. I heard through people who still owe me favors that Robert now works as a consultant, the kind of job men take when they need a title more than they need a paycheck. Daniel is different now. Not fixed, because I don't think 3 years of being told he wasn't enough disappears in half a year, but different. He started his own firm in March, small office, 4 employees, a hand-lettered sign because he wanted to build something with his own name on the glass before he'd let anyone else's touch it. I didn't give him money. I gave him something he needed more. I stepped back and let him fail a little, succeed a little, learn which was which without me hovering. 2 nights ago, he called me just to talk. No crisis, no emergency, just his voice on the phone saying, "Dad, we landed the Kessler account." And I sat in my study and let myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Pride that didn't come wrapped in worry. His wife, Sarah, stayed with him through the fallout, which told me something about her I hadn't fully trusted before. She stopped answering her mother's calls for a while. Family dinners are quieter now, but they're honest, which is worth more than the performance we used to sit through. Here's what I keep coming back to when I lie awake at night. I stayed silent for 3 years. I told myself it was Daniel's battle to fight, that a father who steps in too early raises a son who never learns to stand on his own. There's truth in that lesson. I still believe it. But there's a difference between letting your child struggle and letting people crush him while you watch from the shadows with the power to stop it sitting right there in your hands. I waited too long. I know that now. The only comfort I have is that I didn't wait forever. If there's one thing I want you to carry out of this story, it's this. Silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a patient face. Protecting the people you love doesn't mean fighting every battle for them, but it means knowing exactly when your silence has become a cost they're paying instead of you. I've got more stories like this one. Moments where staying quiet almost cost everything, and the calls that were made just in time, or almost too late. If this kept you here till the end, you already know why you should stick around. Subscribe, because the next story might hit even closer to home than this one did.